South of Moose Jaw, there is, or there was, an abandoned water tower atop a small elevation, which gave a commanding view of the surrounding area, including the distant waters of the semi-mystical Old Wives Lake. It was a great spot to look over the surrounding prairie. It was also a great spot to hang out, smoke, and drink cheap beer, which is what they were doing one night last summer. It was Sierra. Of course it was Sierra who brought it up. We should try summoning Bison Head. What makes you think it, would want to hang out with us, Joey said, being, as usual, a smartass. I don't believe in that stuff, Dwayne announced. But then, he didn't believe in anything. How do you do it? Lorna wanted to know. She was game to try anything. Yeah, anything. They all turned and looked at Willis, the nerd they let hang out with them. If anyone would know, it would be Willis. Summoning Bison Head is pretty simple, supposedly, Willis said in a faltering voice. He hated being the center of attention. All you have to do is say his name 3 times while thinking of a herd of bison. Can you think of like a great steaming pile of buffalo shit? Dwayne bawled. He didn't like Willis and liked to embarrass him. I'm only telling you what I heard, Willis said defensively. He noticed the rest of them laughing, so he pretended to laugh too. Let's try it, Sierra said. She was really liking the idea. You do it, Wilbur, Dwayne ordered. It's, Willis? Yeah, whatever. So, Willis did it. What choice did he have? Bison Head, Bison Head, Bison Head! And as he chanted the name, Willis wished that Bison Head would really come. That just might shut Dwayne up for once in his life. Who, or what, is Bison Head? Back during the days of the great bison, or buffalo herds, a hunter and fur trapper named Vasher roamed the bald prairie. One summer, Vasher fell in with a small group of nomadic First Nations people who were hunting bison. They would locate a herd grazing atop a plateau or elevated spot, then stampede the animals towards the nearest cliff, frightening them into running over the edge. The hunters would then descend and butcher the remains for both food and hides. The First Nations people were primarily interested in bison as a food source, but Vasher was more interested in the hides. They fetched a good price at Fort Garry or down in Minnesota. So Vasher wanted them to kill ever larger numbers of bison, but the others refused. And then there was the woman. History doesn't record her name, but it records that Vasher wanted her for his woman. Her role in the hunt was to don a costume of wolfskins in order to disguise herself as a voracious she-wolf and frighten the bison into stampeding. Vasher would stare at her across the campfire at night. Stare and brood. It came to a head one day when the woman, clad in her wolfskin, was driving the bison towards a nearby cliff. And then suddenly, and without warning, Vasher shot the other First Nations hunters, all 3, out of the saddle. Then he went for the woman. She had turned her head at the first shot and had witnessed the murders. Then she saw Vasher riding towards her. So she turned and ran, ran faster than she had ever run before, and jumped off the cliff, head first. The woman had escaped him in death, but Vasher was an expert at skinning bison for their hides, and so he made himself a belt from her skin, something to remember her by, a keepsake, but also a symbol of evil, which attracted evil. One night, a few weeks later, Vasher was sitting alone by his campfire when he noticed that everything had gone quiet, too quiet. He couldn't even hear the sound of the night wind, and he felt something or someone was watching him. Looking up, he saw the woman he had driven to her death. "What do you want?" Vasher snarled. And when she didn't answer, he told her to bugger off. She took a step towards him, and Vasher noticed the 3 men behind her, the men he had murdered. But Vasher remained calm. "Ghosts don't frighten me," he said quietly. And as he watched, the woman's figure began to shimmer and blur, her skin to darken and become covered with clumps of dark gray fur, her arms becoming elongated, hands becoming claws, her face twisting into a snout, her ears becoming pointed, her eyes turning into 2 orbs of reddish hellfire, and her mouth filling with rows of sharp white teeth. The she-wolf opened her mouth and howled, while Vasher now saw the 3 hunters had the shaggy heads of bison which walked on 2 feet. Vasher's horse had run off in terror, and he had no time to draw his revolver or reach for his rifle before the she-wolf and the bison men charged him, forcing him to retreat, then into a panicked run across the darkened prairie. He didn't know the cliff was there. Until he found himself falling through space. No one knows if Vasher's remains were skinned or eaten, but ever since then, 150 years ago, Vasher has roamed the benighted prairie, a humanoid figure with the body of a man and the enormous, shaggy head of a bison. Willis was still daydreaming about Bison Head when he heard a sharp intake of breath, then Lorna saying, "Who's that?" A man was walking up the road leading to the top of the elevation, a broad, stocky man with a long, dark beard and a full head of shaggy hair. "Hey, are you Bison Head?" asked Sierra, who was the prettier of the 2 girls. The stranger didn't answer, but stared at her, and then grabbed her by the arm, pulling her towards him. "Hey, you!" Dwayne bellowed, walking aggressively towards the stranger. The man released Sierra's arm and took a step back, then began pawing the ground with his cowboy boots. Dwayne laughed as he put his arm around Sierra. "What's the matter, dude? You got to go to the bathroom?" But he had no sooner spoken when the stranger lowered his head and charged. He moved incredibly fast and butted Dwayne's chest with the top of his shaggy head, knocking Dwayne off his feet and through the air until he slammed into the side of the water tower and lay still. Joey ran for the pickup truck, thinking of grabbing a crowbar, but the stranger barreled into him, knocking him off his feet and into the nearby ravine. The man moved back and, once again, pawing his feet on the asphalt, suddenly charged, head down, crashing into the side of the pickup and pushing it into the ravine, and on top of Joey. Lorna tried climbing the ladder at the side of the water tower, but Bison had charged, for it was Bison Head. Bison Head charged, smashing into one of the supporting pillars and knocking it awry. The structure stayed motionless for several seconds, and then collapsed as Lorna screamed and screamed again. But Bison Head was already leaving, hauling Sierra, kicking and screaming, into the darkness. Willis was running down the highway, running towards Moose Jaw. He heard noises behind him, and casting a frightened glance over his shoulder, he saw, running after him, the she-wolf, the bison men, and an entire thundering herd of buffalo. They ran or glided with supernatural speed, and Willis knew he couldn't possibly outrun them. So he threw himself into the ditch, screaming, "Bison Head! Bison Head! Bison Head!" over and over. And he was still screaming when they found him. The next day, 2 cops surveyed the damage. 3 dead, 1 missing, 1 in the psych ward. "What's this Bison Head that kid keeps screaming about?" Some kind of monster or something. You summon it if you say its name 3 times. The first cop began to chant, "Bison Head, Bison Head," and then stopped. "Why'd you stop?" the second cop asked. "I don't know," the first cop admitted. "Something told me not to. Some gut instinct. It's like in those old horror movies, eh? You know, there are some things man is not meant to know." Indeed. Indeed. Two cops stood at the side of a 2-lane highway, which stretched between the Trans-Canada and the U.S. border. In other words, they were standing in the middle of nowhere. They were staring at 2 accident scenes. The first involved a transport truck. The grill of the red tractor had been pushed in, and the trailer knocked backwards and sideways and into the ditch. The second accident scene featured a police car, which was crushed like an aluminum can. 2 ambulances were also on scene, but the bodies on the gurneys were covered by sheets. 1 truck driver, 1 police constable, DOS. DOS, dead on scene. 1 cop had removed his sunglasses, and as he rubbed his eyes said, "They must have collided." "But how?" "I don't see any skid marks. Nothing." "They didn't collide," the other cop said. "Well, then what happened?" said the first cop, with a degree of annoyance in his voice. The second constable shrugged, then said, "Tornado?" It was a question, not a statement. But the sky above them was clear blue, without a cloud and without a breath of wind. A tornado could have done that," the second cop persisted. Unless what?" "Nothing. Come on, you were going to say something." "Well, unless it was that thing the kids all talk about. Bison Head. The man with the head of a bison who can smash things with it." "Never heard of him." "Never heard of it." The second cop shut up. The first cop put his sunglasses back on. "What we need is a witness," he said. "Out here?" the second cop said. It was the first cop's turn to shrug. One of the EMTs walked over and said, "A witness, eh? What about him?" A man was walking towards them. He was thick and stocky and dressed like a cowboy. Boots, jeans, and a checked work shirt. He came striding down the middle of the highway with powerful, purposeful steps. But his most noticeable feature was his enormous head. He had a long, dark beard and a full head of unkempt, reddish-brown hair, piled high and overflowing, like the mane of a bison. He stalked past the wrecked vehicles without giving them a glance, and probably would have continued stumping towards the south, but the cop with the sunglasses accosted him. "You know anything about this?" Sunglasses asked. "Yeah." "You saw it?" "I did it." "You did what?" Sunglasses shouted. "They were in my way." The other cop was laughing uproariously, but when he was finally able to get his breath back, said, "How did you do all this?" The stranger stared at him, then said, in a quiet, conversational voice, "I was walking down the road." He indicated the highway, and the truck wouldn't get out of the way. That still doesn't explain how you did it," the other cop said, still laughing. The stocky man took a step backwards, then began to paw the asphalt with his scuffed cowboy boots before lowering his head and charging towards the nearest ambulance. He moved with superhuman warp speed, hitting the side of the emergency vehicle and crushing it in with the crown of his huge, shaggy head. The tires of the ambulance rose off the ground. It teetered for a moment at a 45-degree angle, and then it collapsed over onto its side, half on, half off the highway. Sunglasses had drawn his service revolver and was pointing it at the strange man. You're under arrest. Get down on the ground, now." For a moment, the stranger just stared at him, and then he began pawing the ground. "Now!" The man lowered his oversized head and charged. Sunglasses fired, but if he managed to hit the charging man, it didn't stop him. He struck the cop mid-chest with his ginormous, shaggy head, knocking Sunglasses high into the air, his body, his corpse, landing barefoot in the ditch, while his shoes, complete with his socks, were left standing on the road. The remaining ambulance burned rubber getting away, so fast it left the gurney with the truck driver's cadaver behind as a memento. The remaining police officer had his hand on the butt of his gun, but didn't dare draw. Instead he said, "You killed him." "He pissed me off." "What? Who are you?" "My name is Vasher, but they call me Bison Head." Vasher was a buffalo hunter and fur trapper who murdered a number of First Nations men and women, and so was condemned to roam the benighted prairies for eternity, a humanoid figure with the body of a man and the enormous, shaggy head of a bison. Earlier in the year, he had been involved in an incident which resulted in the deaths of 2 young people, the disappearance of another, and which left the sole survivor hopelessly insane. Vasher sneered at the cop, then stalked on down the highway, passing the wrecked transport truck, the crushed police car, and the upturned ambulance. The cop didn't try to stop him. Instead, he just stood there, staring. He was still standing there, still staring. A few minutes later, when a long black party limousine cruised past the scene of carnage. The limo slowed down so the partiers could get a good look at the smashed vehicles, allowing a particularly crapulent passenger to moon the stunned cop. The limousine continued down the highway, traveling in the same direction as Vasher, and a few minutes later, the cop heard the sound of squealing tires, followed by a loud metallic crash. When other responders arrived on scene, the only living thing they found was a police officer babbling, "Bison head! Bison head! Bison head!" The cop is now in the psych ward, across from a kid named Willis, sole survivor of the earlier mass murder. And all day and all night, they both chant, "Bison head! Bison head! Bison head!" over and over and over. Kind of a stereo effect, eh? As for the party limousine, it was found several miles down the road from the original accident scene, flattened like a crushed beer can. There were no survivors. My guess is that some a-hole decided to moon Vasher the Bison head. But whoever did that was a real ass, and will soon be an a-hole in the ground. If this is your first visit to my channel, please consider subscribing. My name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring cryptids such as the Night Floaters, werewolves, and the Black-Eyed Children. And now, Bison Head. Please help me to get to 2,021 subs by 2021. Till midnight. Cheers!